12 candles stood in a row on the deal table at Vale Patent Lights, each one 9 inches tall and white as bone, and for the first 10 minutes they burned exactly the way Ambrose Vale had promised the 3 buyers they would. Then the one at the far end sank. Its flame drew down into a widening pool of melted wax, shrank to a blue bead, and went out. The next did the same. By the 6th, one of the buyers laughed and looked at his watch. Lydia Shaw watched from the back wall. She was 30, widowed 11 months, owed 11 weeks of wages along with every woman in her room, and she had nothing of her own but the wax-stained apron she stood in, and a brass wick gauge, 3 notches deep, that Thomas had filed by hand the winter before he died. Behind her, in an old iron test cabinet no one had opened in a week, one candle was still burning. But what Ambrose Vale did not know, when he called across the room to ask who had supervised the wick room, was that the candle behind that iron door would not only change what Lydia Shaw was worth, it would change what every barge and boarding house on that stretch of the Thames burned through the dark. If you have ever been the one they blamed, tell me in the comments. Then look inside the cabinet. The 3 buyers had come up from the wharves that morning of the 4th of October, 1864, and Vale had put out sherry for them, which he never did. The tallest was a man named Pratt, who supplied ship stores at Rotherhithe. The candles were the new full-size composite line, hard stearine with a share of paraffin, meant for men who wanted a candle that would stand up in a cabin without bending. The 7th candle died at 22 minutes. The 8th and 9th went almost together. Each one did the same thing. The flame stayed small from the start, smaller than it should have been for a candle of that thickness, and instead of eating the wax down evenly, it melted a cup around itself. The cup got deeper. The flame got shorter. When the melted wax rose past the point where the wick could lift it, the flame drowned. It was a clean, quiet death, 12 times over. Vale did not look at the candles. He looked at the room until he found her. "Who supervised the wick room on this line?" he said. He said it loud enough for Pratt to hear, and he said it as a question. But Lydia had worked for him for 6 years, and knew he did not ask questions he had not already answered. She did not speak. Behind her left shoulder, the iron test cabinet stood against the wall, its door not quite shut, and through the gap she could see a small yellow point of light that had not moved in the whole half-hour. It was one of the older test candles, set in there and forgotten. Even from where she stood, the wick looked different from the others. It looked flatter. Pratt saw her turn her head and took a step toward the cabinet. "Shut that," Vale said to the boy at the door. "It's an old lot. It's nothing to do with this." The boy shut it. The last candle on the table went out. Nobody had touched the sherry. Lydia Shaw had learned to read a flame the way a river pilot reads water, and it had taken her 16 years and 1 dead husband to do it. She had gone into a tallow works at Lambeth at 16, when her father's boat was sold for debt, and she had gone from dipping to braiding to molding without anyone ever teaching her anything on purpose. A wick that curled to one side told you the plait was uneven. A flame that stood too tall and threw a thread of black at the top told you the wick was drawing more fuel than it could burn. A flame that shrank and sat low in a cup told you the opposite. She could look at a candle for 1 minute and tell you what it would be doing in an hour, and she had never once been asked to write any of it down. The gauge in her apron pocket was the only thing she owned that had been made for her. Thomas Shaw had been a brass finisher at a works in 9 Elms, a slow, careful man with a cough, and he had cut the 3 notches himself. The narrow notch was for a nightlight braid, the middle one for a common candle, the wide one for a full-size stearine wick. He had put it in her hand on a Sunday and said, "There, Liddy, now you can prove it instead of just knowing it." He died the next August with £11 and 4 shillings in the tin under the bed, which was not enough for a workshop and was gone inside a year. At Vale Patent Lights, she was called a wick braider and paid as 9 shillings a week when she was paid, but for 2 years Vale had been sending for her whenever a line went wrong. He would call her into the office, shut the door, ask what she made of a sample, and send her out again. In front of the buyers, or the fitter, or his clerk Henry Wren, he had never once said her name. The other women knew it, which is why they came to her instead of him when the wages stopped. The wages had stopped in July. 11 weeks now. 14 women in the wick and molding rooms, most of them with children, and among them they were owed a little over £60. Vale said the money would come with the wholesale order. That was why the sherry had been out. Lydia knew what had changed on that line, or she knew half of it. In August, a crate had come in from a new cotton house in the city, and with it a set of replacement guides for the braiding frame, narrower than the old ones and drilled tighter. She had taken one to the office and set it beside the old one on his desk. "This will make a thin, hard braid," she had said. "It's a nightlight braid. It won't feed a 9-inch candle." Vale had picked it up, turned it over, and set it down again. "It's the same cotton, Mrs. Shaw. It's a tighter plate. A tighter plate burns cleaner. Ask anyone in the trade." She had asked to run 6 full-size candles through the cabinet before the line went to the molds, and he had said there was no time, that Pratt was coming in October, and every candle they molded had to be a candle they could sell. So the line had gone through on the new guides. She had said her piece to a shut door, and no one else had heard it. Now Pratt was on his way back to Rotherhithe without an order, and Vale had said wick room in front of him. If the fault was hers, then the money that was owed them was money he could argue about. And if he put it about along the river that Lydia Shaw's wick room had spoiled a line, no one on either bank would take her on. He sent for her on the Thursday. Henry Wren, the clerk, was there. A thin, tired man of about 50 with ink on the side of his hand, and Vale had a paper on the desk. "I am not going to argue about whose fault it was," Vale said. "There's no money in it. What there is this." The paper was a leasehold assignment for a place called Marshlight Candle Works, down toward the wharves off the Battersea shore. It was a long, low run of yellow brick with a tall chimney that had not smoked since the spring, and the last tenant had gone bankrupt owing Vale for stock and had signed the lease over to him for the debt. There were 7 years left on it at £22 a year, payable at Lady Day. There was a braiding frame in it, 2 banks of molds, cooling racks, a melting room, and something over £300 weight of composite candles that Vale did not want. "The rejected stock goes with it," he said. "All of it. The whole failed line, and whatever else is lying about in there. I want it off my books and out of my building. In return, I consider the wages settled, yours and the rest of the rooms, and I'll say so in writing." "You'll say the wages are settled," Lydia said, "and I'll have a building with a hole in the roof and 300 weight of candles that don't burn." "You'll have a candle works," Vale said, "which is more than a wick braider generally gets." She asked for a night to think about it, and he gave her until noon the next day, which she understood was because he wanted the candles gone before anyone else looked at them. That eagerness was the only part of the offer that interested her. What she wanted was the £60. £60 would have paid every woman what she was owed and put Lydia back on the street with a bad name attached to her. The other choice was a dead works and a lease she could not pay come March, and 14 women looking at her to make it into something. If it failed under her name, it failed for all of them, and she would be the one who had asked them to wait. She went back the next morning at 11 and said yes, on one condition. She wanted a written inventory of everything in the building, item by item, with the braiding frame named, and the molds, and the racks, and the rejected stock by weight and lot, signed by Vale and witnessed by Henry Wren, with a copy for her. Vale laughed at that. "You want a schedule of rubbish. I want to know what I've been paid with," she said. He shrugged and told Wren to do it. Wren spent the afternoon at Marshlight with a lantern and a notebook, and came back with 4 pages in his small, careful hand. Item: 1 adjustable wick plating frame, iron, with guides. Item: 2 molding banks of 144 molds each, some bent. Item: rejected composite stock, lots 18 through 26, approximately 310 pounds. He wrote it out fair twice, and Vale signed both, and Wren signed under him, and Lydia folded her copy into the pocket where the gauge was. She told the women that evening, in the yard behind the wick room. Nobody cheered. Martha Dunn, who was 38 and had molded there 9 years, asked how she meant to pay them. Lydia said she did not know yet. 3 of them went into Marshlight Works on the Monday, the 10th of October, with a borrowed lantern and a bucket of soda. Annie Pike came because she had been a packer at Vale's, was 19, wrote the best hand in the building, and had nowhere else to go. Elias Fenner came because Lydia asked him. He was 58, had fitted molding machines for 30 years, and had 2 fingers on his right hand that had not bent since a frame came down on them in 1851. He had been mending mangles in his kitchen since the summer. The molding room was cold enough to see your breath. Wax lay on the floor in a gray skin half an inch thick, and under the skin the drains had backed up and gone sour. The melting room was black to the rafters. One pan still had a crust of old composite in the bottom, and when Elias tried the drain valve, the handle turned and nothing happened. They started with light. Elias got the shutters open on the riverside, and Lydia and Annie went along the molding room with a spade and a coal scuttle, lifting the floor wax in slabs and stacking it by the door for reboiling. Under it the drain grate was choked with wick ends and rag. Annie cleared it with a stick in her hand and swore once, and did not complain again all day. By 3 o'clock the water ran. Elias took the melting pan valve apart on the bench, found the seat scored and the spring gone, filed the seat and packed the stem with tow, and put it back. It held. The second pan would need a new valve cast, which was 11 shillings he did not have. The rejected stock was stacked in the packing room in open crates, lots 18 through 26, exactly as Wren had written. Full-size candles mostly, 9" by 7/8, hard and white and perfect to look at. There were also 2 crates of odds from earlier lots, slim nightlights, some 6" commons, and 1 small box of loose test candles with the old cabinet numbers still chalked on the ends. She broke up 2 of the rejected candles, wicks and all, and melted the pieces slow on the 1 working pan, keeping the fire well down so nothing scorched, and poured the clear melt into a shallow earthenware saucer. Into the saucer she stood a short length of wick from her own apron pocket, a piece of the old plait from before August, the kind she had braided by the 1,000-yard. She let the melt firm to a skin, then lit the wick. It burned. It burned as clean a flame as she had ever seen from a composite, upright and steady, no smoke, and it went on for 2 hours until the saucer was dry. Annie asked what it meant. "It means the wax will burn," Lydia said. "So the wax isn't what killed those 12. She tried the nightlights next. They were from the same lots, molded from the same kettles on the same days, and they were slim, no thicker than a finger. She lit 6. Everyone burned steadily for over 4 hours. And when she blew them out there was a small even cup of melt in each, and a wick that had bent its tip over into the flame the way a good wick should. If it was the material, the thin ones should have died too. So if the wax burned in a saucer, and the wax burned in a nightlight, why did it die in a 9" candle? Keep that question in your hand, because Lydia was about to answer it wrong before she answered it right. The small box of loose test candles was where the survivor turned up. Annie found it. She was going through the crates with a stub of pencil, writing lot numbers on paper labels and tying one to every bundle, because Lydia had said they must know where every candle came from or none of it would mean anything. In the box of odds was a 9" candle burned down to about 5 inches, its top a clean, shallow cup. On the base, in chalk, was the cabinet mark from Vale's testing room. It was the one from behind the iron door. She did not light it. She wanted it whole until she understood it. Instead, she set Annie to labeling and Elias to the molding bank nearest the firewall, where perhaps 90 of the 144 molds were straight enough to use, and she began to test. She kept the melt the same for every trial, skimmed from the same reboiled stock, and held just above the point where it went clear. She molded 8 thin candles and 8 commons and 8 full-size, and she wicked them all from the same hank of Vale's narrow August plate, which had come down in the crates with the rejected stock, and was the only wick in the building in any quantity. Annie chalked a number on the base of every one, and wrote it in a penny notebook. They lit them in a row on the trimming bench with the shutters closed against draft. The 8 thin candles burned steadily. The 8 commons burned, but low, with a cup that grew deeper than it should. The 8 full-size candles began well and, one after another between the 20th and 35th minute, drowned. Same wax. Same wick. The only thing that changed was how much candle stood around the wick. Elias came and looked at the dead ones. Lydia said the wick was too small for the candle. Elias asked how she knew. She said she could see it. He looked at her for a moment and said that seeing it was not the same as being able to show a buyer, and went back to his molds. That night, alone, she took the survivor and worked its wick out of the wax with a warm knife. She laid it on a white card under the hand lens Thomas had left with his tools. It was not the August plate. It was wider across and flatter, and when she pressed it between finger and thumb it gave a little instead of feeling like cord. Vale's narrow braid had 3 strands pulled hard. This had more threads in each strand and was laid looser, so the flat of the braid was nearly twice as wide. It was the old wick, from before August, from before the new guides. It was the plate she had braided for 2 years. She measured it in the gauge. It sat in the wide notch. Vale's sat in the narrow one, the nightlight notch, just as she had told him in August. She did not yet have anything on paper that a stranger would believe. What she had was a dead man's gauge, a 5-inch candle stub, and her word. But thin candles she could sell. Over the next 4 days, she and Annie molded and wicked 24 6-inch slims from the reboiled stock, on the narrow wick, and everyone burned true. Lydia sold 2 dozen to a grocer named Kettle on the York Road for 1 and 8 pence, the first money the works had made in a year. Then she made her mistake, and it was a large one. Her reasoning was this. The full-size candles died because the flame could not draw the melt fast enough. But instead of asking what was wrong with the wick, she asked what was wrong with the wax, because it was the wax she could change with what she had. Vale's composite was hard stearine with only a small share of paraffin. If she softened it, made it melt easier and lower, the same wick might carry it. She had seen it done in cheap composite lines. She had 100 weight of crate wax that Wren had not bothered to weigh, and she wanted full-size candles for sale before the end of October, because full-size was where the money was. She told Elias what she meant to do. He said one thing. "You're changing 2 things at once." "I'm changing one," she said. "The wick stays the same. The wick's the thing you think is wrong." She went ahead. She cut the stock with a softer paraffin she got on credit from a dealer in 9 Elms at 5 pence the pound, better than a quarter by weight, and she ran 2 gross of 9-inch candles through the good molding bank in 3 days. They came out of the molds a shade more yellow than the originals, with a faint greasy look on the surface but whole and straight. They stayed lit. That much she had got right. When they lit 12 on the trimming bench, not one drowned. But they burned wrong. The flames were long and hungry, and leaned with every breath of air. Within the first hour a thread of black smoke began to rise off the tops. The softer wax could not hold its own cup. It ran, over the rim, down the sides, into pools on the bench, and by the 3rd hour the molding room ceiling had a gray bloom on it, and Annie's eyes were running. Hester Cole came to see them because Lydia had asked her to. Hester was 52, kept a boarding house of 11 rooms on the Bridge Road, bought a gross of candles every month for stairs and bedrooms, and had said she would try anything that did not stink and did not drip. She stood in the doorway of the molding room with her shawl over her nose and looked at the row of leaning flames and the black on the ceiling. "No," she said. "They stay lit," Lydia said. "So does a chimney fire. I've got girls carrying candles up 3 flights past a wooden banister. I want a flame that stands still, and I want a candle that doesn't grease the stair carpet. Those drip. Those smoke. I wouldn't put one in a coal cellar." She looked at Lydia. "You told me you knew candles." "I do." "Then make me one I'd buy." Hester left. Lydia counted what the 2 gross had cost. A quarter of her spare stock. 11 shillings in paraffin she had not paid for. 4 days of coal and 4 days of Annie and Elias, and the last of her own faith that she could think her way through this by feel alone. Elias said nothing to her about it that evening, and that was worse than if he had. She sat by the melting pan fire with the survivor's wick on its white card in her lap, and understood that she had spent a week proving that soft wax dripped, which she had already known, and had learned nothing about the wick. She would change one thing at a time from now on. She said it out loud, to the empty room, so that she would remember having said it. The next morning she started with the wick, and nothing else. She unpicked the survivor's plat on the white card with a needle, 1 strand at a time, and laid the strands out side by side and counted the threads in each. Then she did the same with the length of Vale's August wick. She wrote both counts on the card herself, in pencil, which was the first time in 16 years she had written down a wick. The old plate had 3 strands, and each strand had more threads than the new, and the braid was laid at a slacker angle so that it lay flat and had room in it. The new one had fewer threads apiece, pulled up so tight that the braid was round in section and hard as bootlace. A wick lifts melted wax up through the spaces between its threads. There were not enough spaces in Vale's wick to lift what a 9-inch candle made. Annie found the rest. One of the crates that had come down from Vale's with the rejected stock held a spare set of the narrow guides, still in their paper, and under the paper, tacked to the inside of the lid, an invoice stub from a cotton house in Wood Street. It was made out to Ambrose Vale, Vale Patent Lights, and dated the 19th of August, 1864. 2 bales of plating cotton, a lower count than the old, and 1 set of 6 replacement plating guides, narrow bore. In the margin, in Vale's own hand, which Annie knew from 100 packing tickets, was a line of figures. Saving on wick, 1 shilling and 4 pence the gross. Annie put it on the bench beside the white card without a word. Then she went through the rejected stock. She had a memory for labels that was close to strange, and she went crate by crate reading the lot chalk. Lot 18 was the first full-size lot molded after the 22nd of August. Every full-size candle in the rejected stock was lot 18 or later. Every one. The nightlights that burned were lots 12 and 14. The survivor's cabinet mark, when Annie worked it against her memory of the test room slate, was lot 11, molded in July on the old wick. Annie wrote it all out in the penny notebook in 3 columns, lot, date, and burned or drowned, and when she was done there was a line down the page at the 19th of August as clean as a knife. Elias, meanwhile, had the braiding frame in pieces. It was an old adjustable frame, iron, of the same pattern as Vale's, with guide plates that could be swapped or moved to change how many strands went into the plate and how hard it was pulled up. Its own guides were worn to nothing. But when Vale's men had fitted the narrow guides in August, they had thrown the old wide ones in a bin, and the bin had come to Marshlight because Wren had written it down as sundry iron. Elias found 4 of the 6 in it and made the 5th and 6th from a bit of brass plate with a drill and small files, working with his 2 good fingers and the heel of his hand. It took him 5 days. When he was done, the frame would take either set, and a third setting between them. None of it surprised Lydia. She had told Vale in August. But it was one thing to know it and another to see it laid out on paper by a girl of 19 who 3 weeks ago had not known a plate from a knot. And it told her only why Vale's candles died. It did not tell her how to make one that lived, and it did not pay the lease. The right wick was not simply a bigger one. She set out to prove it, on the same cotton, with the melt kept the same, and one thing changed at a time. Elias set the frame 3 ways. First, with the widest old guides slacked right off, so that the plait came out broad and loose, a fat soft braid you could crush flat with your thumb. Second, with Vale's narrow guides pulled up hard, exactly as the August wick had been made. Third, with the old guides at their proper setting, the way she had run the frame at Vale's for 2 years, a moderate flat plait with the strands laid at a middling angle. She braided 20 yards of each with her own hands. Annie tagged the hanks A, B, and C, and Lydia checked each in the gauge. A would not fit the wide notch. B sat in the narrow. C sat in the wide notch, and no farther. They molded 8 9-inch candles from each hank, all from the same kettle of reboiled composite, poured within the same hour, cooled on the same rack. Annie chalked them. A1 through A8, B1 through B8, C1 through C8. They lit all 24 on the bench at 9 in the morning by the melting room clock, with the shutters closed and a white card stood behind each candle so that soot would show. The B candles did what Vale's had done. Small flame from the start, deepening cup, and one by one between the 20th and 40th minute they drowned. Not one of the 8 lasted an hour. The A candles were the softened batch all over again, though the wax was hard. The loose fat wick drank the melt faster than the flame could burn it. The flame stood tall and yellow and threw black at the tip, and by the end of the first hour every white card had a smear of soot on it, and the wick heads had swelled into a bloom of carbon. 2 of the 8 had run over the rim by noon. They were still lit at 4 o'clock, but each had lost near half its length. The C candles burned. That was all they did, and it was everything. The flame stood at a steady height, a little above an inch, with a clear blue at the base and no thread of smoke. The cup formed and stayed shallow. The wick did what a good plated wick will do when the plate is right for the candle, which is bend its tip over into the outer edge of the flame and burn itself away as it goes, so that it never gets long and never needs snuffing. At 4 o'clock all 8 were burning. Their white cards were white. Annie measured them against a ruler and wrote down the length left on each. The 8 were within a 1/4 inch of one another. Lydia did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Write it out proper," and Annie made the first true test card of Marshlight Works, ruled in pencil, with a line for lot, for braid, for the size of the candle, the time lit, what the flame did at each hour, whether it smoked, whether it dripped, and the length left when they put it out. Lydia signed it at the bottom, and after a moment's thought, so did Annie. It was the answer. It was also 24 candles. To sell by the gross she would need to make that plate, and center it, and pour around it, and cool it, and test it, several hundred times a week, without once losing what she had just found. She had the plait. She did not yet have a works. They built the works through the last of October and November. The chimney went first because nothing else would run without it. A bricklayer named Joseph Abbott, 60, from behind the bridge road, went up it with a ladder and a boy and told her the crack was in the top 8 courses and the rest was sound. He wanted £3. She had £1.6. She paid that down and the rest against the first month's sales, and he did the job in 4 days and never once asked what a woman wanted with a candle chimney. Elias had the second melting pan valve cast at a small foundry in 9 Elms for 11 shillings, fitted it, and then turned to the molds. Both banks were of the ordinary sort. Tin molds set point down in a frame with the wick drawn up through the tip and held at the top by a centering bar with slots in it. On the second bank, 30 molds were bent, and the centering bars were missing altogether. He straightened the molds one at a time over a mandrel, and one evening he said something. "You've been at that frame since 7, and you'll be at the molds till 10. You've a fitter standing here with nothing in his hands. I know how I want it done. Then tell me and I'll do it. It's not a thing you have to carry up the stairs yourself. That's what a works is." He said it without heat, and went back to the mandrel, and she thought about it more than she let on. The cooling racks came next, and the shutters. Marshlight had failed partly because whoever ran it last had rushed the cooling to turn the molds over faster, and rushed composite cracks. Elias rehung the shutters to hold a draft off the racks, and Lydia set the racks level, because a tilted mold in cooling lets the wick lean. By the middle of November she took back 4 of the women. Martha Dunn, 38, to the molds. Sarah Quill, 26, and Nora Beck, 44, to the wicking and trimming. Ellen Pryor, 31, to the packing benches. Lydia paid them by the day, 8p for the first fortnight while there was little to sell, and Annie wrote every day and every name in a wages book that cost 4p, and every woman made her mark against her line on Saturday. Lydia had never seen a wages book at Vale's. She had only ever seen the sums that were not in one. She trained them the way she wished someone had trained her. Every wick threaded, and then checked at the tip and at the bar before a drop went in. Every mold looked at as it came out for a shine down one side, which meant a shift in cooling. Every candle rolled on the bench to hear if it was cracked, because a cracked composite rings dull. And every batch, without exception, gave up 6 numbered candles to the test cabinet before the rest went to the packing room. The first full run on the second bank showed her why. 24 of the candles came out with the wick a shade off center, and when they lit 6, 3 guttered, the flame leaning to the thin side and eating a channel down that wall while the thick side stood up unburned. Lydia found that the new centering bars had slots a fraction too wide, so the wick could drift while the melt was still soft. She and Elias filed the slots to a closer fit and added a second bar lower on the frame so each wick was held at 2 points. She threw the 24 back in the pan. It cost a day. By the end of November, they had made a run of 3 gross that she was willing to put her word on. Everyone had been wicked on the C plate, poured from a kettle that never scorched, cooled slow behind the shutters, trimmed, rolled, and 6 of every 144 burned to the end in the cabinet and written up. She took a dozen to Hester Cole. Hester did not test them on a bench. She put them where she used candles. On the stairs, in a back bedroom, in the scullery where the draft came off the yard. She let her girls carry them up and down. She waited a week. Then she came down to Marshlight herself and told Lydia she would take a gross a month at 8p the pound, and that if they ever dripped on her stair carpet she would bring them back and say so. "That'll do," Lydia said. Samuel Reed came in the first week of December, on foot, without warning, and stood in the loading yard looking at the chimney until somebody noticed him. He was 44, a ship chandler with a warehouse and a wharf frontage below the railway bridge, and he supplied colliers, lighters and coasting brigs with everything from rope to lamp oil to candles. He had bought from Vale for 6 years and had stopped in the autumn because 2 lots had come back from a brig's master. Hester Cole was his sister-in-law's cousin, and Hester had told him about the ones on her stairs. He did not want to see the works. He wanted to see the cards. Annie brought him the test book, and he read it standing at the trimming bench for a quarter of an hour, and then he asked to see 6 candles from a batch of his own choosing, and he chose one from the middle of the ledger and not the latest, which Lydia noticed. She lit them for him. He watched for 1 hour by his own watch, and then made his offer. He would take 6 gross, 864 candles, 9-inch full-size composite, at 8p halfpenny the pound, if she passed a test. The test would be in his warehouse, in the second week of January, in front of witnesses he chose. She would deliver 2 sealed boxes of a gross each, and so would Vale, whom he meant to give a fair chance to answer the complaint. 12 candles from each would be drawn by lot and burned for 4 hours side by side. If hers held and Vale's did not, He would sign for the 6 gross that day, and for a gross a month after that, so long as every delivery gave up 6 candles to a burn he could watch. If hers failed, he would buy nothing, and he would say so to anyone who asked. "I don't buy on sympathy," he said, "and I don't buy on a woman's word or a man's either. I buy on what stands up on the table." Lydia said yes. Vale heard within the week. He came to Marshlight himself, on the 11th of December, in a good coat, and stood in the molding room among the women who had worked for him, and looked at the racks and the shutters and the frame with the old guides in it, and Lydia saw him understand what he was looking at. He asked to speak to her alone, and she said whatever he had to say he could say in the room. He said it. He offered her a partnership. Vale Patent Lights would take over the lease and the stock and the debts, and Lydia would run the wick and testing rooms at £1 a week, double what she had ever had from him, and her plat and her cards and her women would come under his name. He said it plainly, and it was, on the arithmetic, a fair offer. "No," Lydia said. "You'll not raise the lease money by March on a gross a month to a boarding house." "Then I'll not raise it," she said, "but I'll not go back to telling you what's wrong through a shut door." He looked at her a moment longer, and then at the frame, and then he went. The rest of December was Vale answering that no in the only ways he had. The cotton house in Wood Street, which had been supplying Lydia's plaiting yarn on a fortnight's credit, wrote to say the account was closed and no further bales would be sent. Vale had bought from them for 11 years. A rumor started along the wharves that the Marshlight candles were made from condemned wax and had set a lodging-house curtain alight in 9 Elms, which cost her a grocer in the Wandsworth Road. And on the 20th of December a letter came from a solicitor in the city, on Vale's instruction, informing Mrs. Shaw that the adjustable plating frame at Marshlight Works had been the property of Vale Patent Lights, on loan to the former tenant, and had never formed part of the assignment, and requiring its return within 14 days. Then it turned cold. On the 28th of December the wind came round to the northeast and stayed there, and the molding room went from cold to bitter. Composite poured into cold molds cools too fast on the outside and cracks from the surface in. The first 2 racks that came off in the new year had cracks in a third of the candles. Lydia lit 6 from the batch anyway, because that was the rule now, and 2 guttered where the crack let the melt through, and she put the whole rack back in the pan. 3 days' work gone. Then the Wood Street bale that had been promised did not come, and there were 9 days of cotton left in the building. She sat down that night in the packing room, with the solicitor's letter and the empty cotton bin and Annie's book, and worked out that she could withdraw from Reed's test and keep Hester's gross going and perhaps get to Lady Day, or she could go to Reed's with what she had, and lose the frame the week after. She did not see a third way, and she did not tell anyone, and she went about the next day so short with the women that Martha Dunn asked her outright what was the matter. So she told them. All of it. At the trimming bench, the frame and the cotton and the cold and the test. It was the hardest thing she had done at Marshlight, because she had spent 16 years believing that if she said a thing was wrong out loud, someone would take it away from her. Annie went straight to her paper box. Lydia's copy of the inventory had gone into the tin under the melting room bench in October and had come out again in November, and Annie had put it where she put everything, in a box she had lettered on the lid, between Vale's invoice stub and the first test card. Item: 1 adjustable wick plating frame, iron with guides, signed A. Vale, witnessed H. Wren. Lydia wrote to Henry Wren asking whether he remembered writing it, and Wren, who was a tired man and not a dishonest one, wrote back that he did, that he had a fair copy in his own hand still, and that he would say so if asked. Lydia sent both to the solicitor. She heard nothing more about the frame. Elias went to see a man named Daniel Kemp, 40, who twisted small cordage and lampwick in 2 rooms off Battersea Fields. Kemp did not carry plating cotton in the count she used, but he had a finer yarn in quantity, and he would sell her 40 pounds of it for cash. It was finer, so the C setting on the frame would give a plait too thin. Lydia spent a whole day at the frame with the gauge, running short lengths and testing each in a saucer, adding threads to each strand until the plate sat in the wide notch and burned like C in a 9-inch candle. Elias could not have done that for her, and did not try. He fetched the yarn and set the frame where she told him. She changed the cooling. She had the racks brought in from the river wall to the fire wall and hung old sacking over the shutters, and let each rack stand a full day longer than before, and molded half a bank at a time so that no batch was too big to watch. It cut what they could make in a week by nearly half. Nobody argued. And she stopped doing everything herself. Martha Dunn ran the molds and answered for them. Sarah Quill ran the frame, at Lydia's setting, checked twice a day with the gauge and written down. Annie ran the cabinet and the cards and the wages book, and every candle for Reed's went through her pencil before it went in a box. Lydia went between them. It felt, the first few days, like giving away her only tools. By the end of the week she found she had time to look at things. By the 10th of January there were 2 gross for Reed's, cracked ones thrown back, every batch with its 6 on a card, and Reed's clerk came down and set his own seal across the lids. The test was on the 12th, a Thursday, in the long room over Reed's warehouse, with the river going by gray under the windows and a coke stove at each end to keep the air still. Reed had set a table down the middle with 24 tin sconces in 2 rows, and a white card stood up behind each. The witnesses were Reed himself, his foreman, a man named Coombs, Hester Cole, the master of a collier brig, Pratt, the chandler from Rotherhithe, who had been at Vale's table in October, and a Mr. Selby who kept a warehouse on the 9 Elms shore. Vale came with Henry Wren. He looked at Lydia once when he came in and did not look at her again for some time. Reed broke the seals himself. From each of the 4 boxes his boy, blindfolded with a handkerchief, drew 3 candles, and Coombs chalked them, V1 through V12, S1 through S12, and stood them in the sconces so that Vale's and Shaw's alternated down the table. Lydia measured every wick against a rule and trimmed each to a 1/4 inch, Vale's and hers alike, with Wren watching her hands. Reed lit them all from 1 taper. 10 minutes past 10. For the first half hour there was nothing to see and no one spoke. Then, at about the 35th minute, V4 began to sink. Its flame drew down and the cup around it deepened. Pratt leaned in and said, "There, that's the one from October." And Vale said nothing. V4 drowned at 48 minutes. But it was not only that. Vale had not stood still since October any more than she had. Some of his 12 were burning on a different wick, a wider one, and by the end of the first hour those had begun to throw a thread of black up their cards, and V9's flame stood a full 2 inches, and by 11:30 had run over its rim onto the tin. V7 guttered down one side, the wick off center. V2 drowned at 1 hour and 20. Of Vale's 12 at the end of 4 hours, 2 were out, 3 had run, 4 had blackened their cards, and 3 had burned true. It was a table with 2 mistakes on it, and no answer between them. Her 12 burned. Steady, at a little over 1 inch, cups shallow, tips bent into the flame, cards white. Coombs measured them at 2 o'clock. The longest and shortest of the 12 were within 3/8 of an inch. Vale spoke then. He said the draw had been done in the wrong order, and the trimming had favored one side, and that a single sample of 12 proved nothing about a gross. Reed did not answer him. He looked at Lydia. She had brought the book. She put it on the table open at the lot columns, and Annie's test cards beside it, 3 months of them, and beside those the invoice stub from Wood Street with the margin note in Vale's hand, and the penny notebook with the line down the page at the 19th of August. She said what the narrow wick did in a 9-inch candle, and what the wide loose one did, and what the plat she used did. And she said it in about as many words as it takes to say here. Reed read the invoice stub twice and passed it to Pratt, and Pratt passed it to Wren, and Wren looked at it and then at the floor. Reed signed at the table. 6 gross, at 8 halfpenny the pound, £4 advance, and a gross a month from February, conditional on 6 candles burned in his sight from every delivery. Hester said she would take 2 gross a month now instead of 1. Selby asked what she could do in nightlights. Vale stood through all of it. When Reed's pen was down, he took his hat from the end of the table, said good afternoon to Reed, and went down the stairs with Wren behind him. He had not looked at the 12 white cards. He had looked at the ledger. The advance came on the Saturday in coin, and Lydia and Annie sat at the packing bench with the wages book open and paid the oldest weeks first, July's, to Martha and Nora and Sarah and Ellen and the 3 others from the old room who had come back since, and each made her mark, and Annie ruled the line under it. Then the bricklayer, then Kemp, then herself. 9 shillings, which was what she had always been paid, because the book said so. Annie Pike was entered in the book that day as batch and testing clerk at 12 shillings, and signed her own line. Vale came once more, in the last week of February, when the second monthly gross had gone down to Reed's and burned 6 out of 6. He offered to buy the lease and the works outright at a sum that would have paid every debt she had and left £40 over. She heard him out on the step, and said no, and thanked him, and went in. The sign went up on the last day of the month, painted by Abbott's boy in black on white board over the yard gate. Shaw Candle Works. Inside, on the wall of the testing room, above the shelf where the ledger lay open, Elias screwed 2 brass hooks, and on them hung Thomas's gauge with its 3 notches, where anyone who came to read the book could take it down and put a wick in it. "There, Liddy," he had said. "Now you can prove it instead of just knowing it." She had thought at the time he meant the gauge. She was 30 years old and a widow when Ambrose Vale settled 11 weeks of wages with a cold building, 300 pounds of candles that would not burn, and his signature on 4 pages he thought were a list of rubbish. It was the only settlement she ever took, and it turned out to be the one worth having. On the 1st of March she went into the packing room, put her hand into an open box of that morning's batch without looking, and took out 1 candle. She stood it in the cabinet, lit it, looked at the clock, wrote the time on the card in her own hand, and went back to the frame. When Annie looked in an hour later, the flame was where it had been.